Hello again. Going to talk a little bit in advance about January's upcoming NFL Public Forum topic, Resolved. Development assistance should be prioritized over military aid in the Sahel region of Africa. Now, before I talk about individual terms in the topic, I want to talk about some terms that are not in the topic. The topic is in passive voice, and it is actor agnostic, actor neutral. So what that means is that not only does it not say who should be providing the aid or the assistance, but it doesn't say from whose perspective we should view this. So this can be looked at from a U.S. perspective, from an African perspective, from a global perspective. There's a lot of different options to this, and the question also is whose interests are we looking at this in? Does it matter if the aid would benefit the person giving it? Does it matter if the aid would benefit the country receiving it? So this doesn't necessarily deal with public versus private, national versus multinational, within Africa versus outside of Africa. Those are just assumptions that a lot of teams will have going into the round that aren't necessarily supported by the resolution. If one team is able to prove that the African Union should send peacekeeping troops to help some of its members, then that would be one way of upholding the resolution. If one team argues that it would not be in the United States' interests for the UN to supply developmental aid through UNICEF because of corruption, that could also be a way of disproving the resolution or not, depending on how the other team interprets it and whose interests they say should come first. So those are some things to keep in mind when looking at the actual terms in this topic. So let's start out talking about development assistance. Development assistance can be temporary, it can be a loan, it can be ongoing, it can be a gift. There's a lot of things that can go into that. Very often, development assistance is talking about stuff from multinational neoliberal organizations, such as the WTO or the World Bank, who will give money to countries specifically earmarked for certain kinds of development and with conditions placed on it in terms of either trade agreements or how the money will be used, or who is going to profit from where the money is spent in the long term. That's a fairly narrow definition. Obviously, it benefits the pro team to be able to define it more broadly, to talk about development and to talk about assistance independently, and say, well, anything that assists in development is development assistance, so anything that enables development, for instance, might also count. Under this broader definition, humanitarian aid would fall under development assistance because humanitarian aid averts famine, it averts drought, enabling development. Khan doesn't want to let pro get away with that. They want to be able to say development assistance is only the way the term is used by organizations whose mission statements claim that they aim to provide development assistance. One thing that's certainly clear is that development assistance is not military aid. Any definition you have that defines the words collectively is going to specifically exclude military aid. It may be a precondition for development assistance, but it is not development assistance in and of itself. So what that means is that you're in a situation where you're looking at two opposing terms, each of which might be able to enable the other, but neither of which necessarily can be part of the other, which makes prioritized a little easier to define. Prioritized is going to come into two different kinds of definitions here. The first is a question of priority. The second is going to be a question of amount. So priority as in time frame versus priority as in magnitude. And when you're looking at that, an easy way to explain that is to be able to say, for instance, let's say 40% of the solution is military and 60% of the solution is developmental. You might say, well, one is the greater amount than the other, so the developmental solution needs to come first. On the other hand, if you're looking at a military solution, then you can say, well, this solution is going to be a lower percentage overall of what's needed, but it needs to be done first. So it should be prioritized in that it comes before the other, not that it's going to be more of it than the other. This is definitely something that Khan wants to be able to do. Pro wants to argue that prioritize is a question of which should be a larger portion of the solution. And there are many situations in the Sahel when you can talk about how developmental assistance might be important, but military aid might not. But it's very rare to find any situation there where military aid is useful without developmental assistance to follow up, Otherwise, it creates the same situations of instability that led to other countries providing military aid in the first place. All right, let's talk about the Sahel region briefly, because that's one place that definitions get a little more complicated. There's a lot of different areas in Africa that are called part of the Sahel or excluded from being part of the Sahel. Generally speaking, it's talking about the southern edge of the Sahara. And the southern edge of the Sahara is an area that keeps expanding throughout, a little below the continent's widest point. It's generally west central Africa. It's far enough south that you're not talking about Arabic inhabitants, so not talking about Arab inhabitants, you're talking about inhabitants of a bunch of different ethnicities throughout Senegal, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, Benin, Togo, Ghana, the Central African Republic, and arguably the Cape Verde Islands as well, depending on whose definition you use. So that's a lot of countries, so I want to talk a little bit about the big four. And those are going to be Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and Chad. No matter which definition of the Sahel you use, those countries are going to fall into it. Pro would rather talk about them and the 5 countries to the south of them. Con would rather talk about them and the 3 countries off to the east of them. Either way, it's worth noting that when the topic was released, definitions were a little bit unusual for this. On the topic ballot for coaches and advisors, the Forensics League actually said that when voting on this topic, coaches are to use the definitions as provided by the OECD. I don't know if the OECD is actually the topic sponsor or not. If this topic's release just happens to coincide with Sahel Awareness Week in the OECD, there's really not much transparency as to that stuff. What I do know is that even though coaches were asked to use the OECD definitions when picking topics, there is no similar caveat in debating the topic, so you shouldn't feel bound by framers' intent. One thing to keep in mind, though, with all these different definitions, some of them are based on latitude and longitude, some of them are based on historical borders of the Sahara, some of them are based on annual rainfall, some of them are based on the geography of the countries. Like I said, some start including the highlands as you get off to the east. Some include the areas that are a little bit more damp down to the south. Cameroon is geographically right in the middle of what would normally be considered the Sahel, but it has a lot more water than its neighboring countries, so organizations like UNICEF tend to actually exclude it when defining that. But it's often best to merge or to err on the inclusive side on definitions, unless your definition has a very good reason to exclude the other team's definition. So when you're looking at that, if they say, well, the Sahel includes these 3 countries that your definition doesn't, and yours includes one that theirs don't, unless there is some reason that including their country would be bad for the debate, you might as well just talk about all of them. Generally speaking, if you're going to exclude it, it should be because one of your arguments relies on that country not being included. For instance, if your case talks very heavily about water, and they're saying that countries which don't suffer from the drought that normally characterizes the Sahel, according to UNICEF, count as that, then you should argue, well, maybe in those cases there are other issues that matter more, but the Sahel as a whole still needs this kind of assistance. So that's one way that you can deal with it. And the other, of course, is just to explain why your definition is more specific, but rarely do you actually gain something from doing that on this. So when we're looking at the Sahel region, a couple things that stand out about it as a whole. First off, the majority of it is desert, more so than was 20 years ago. Second off, it's become a more unstable area recently than it was during the Cold War, which not a lot of regions of the world can say. After recent defeats in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda relocated a lot of its forces to Mali. Since then, France has been fighting a fairly quiet war with Al-Qaeda in the desert of Mali, which reached a peak about a year and a half ago, I believe, but has since diminished in violence, but there's still military presence and terrorist organizations there. The second issue of instability there is just various government coups, especially if you start including the countries to the southwest portion of it, you're looking at a lot of countries where various factions are still fighting for control, where the colonels and generals in power may decide that they want to become the presidents in power, and where there's still ongoing violence with that. That both creates the instability that might make military aid necessary, but it also creates an argument against military aid, as there are very few good people to give military aid to who we are sure have the best interests of their country at heart. This becomes even more complicated when you notice that the military aid the resolution specifies does not have to come from the US. China, for instance, especially if you look at the eastern part of Africa, has a very different idea of which factions are deserving of military aid than the United States does. If you look down to the south, there are a lot of different factions that, even if they are aligned with Shell Oil, even if they are aligned with Chevron, are not going to necessarily be doing what's best for their people. And if it's the African Union who is supplying the aid, they're not going to be nearly as receptive to that as we are. When you're looking at these things, one thing that I would caution, try to avoid the ivory tower effect in your research. Try to find at least some authors who are from these countries in question, who have at least been to these countries in question, because a lot of times authors who have not don't know about the country as much as they know about the region, and they will make generalizations that don't do your case any good. So find someone who actually has some personal experience with the area to supplement your evidence, even if it does not comprise all of your evidence. Someone who studied Al-Qaeda a lot for the Brookings Institution before Al-Qaeda relocated to Mali might not know enough about Mali to understand why Al-Qaeda acting in the Sahel is different. Whether it's a question of historical imperial boundaries, whether that's a question of resource scarcity, whether it's a question of different sects of Islam among the locals, whether it's a question of history of reactions to intervention, those could all be things that would change that someone who isn't actually familiar with the countries in question is going to overlook. And that's something that's definitely beyond the scope of this short video, but I can certainly put up more details on that for you later on. So, when you're looking at this topic as a whole, Pro's advantages are generally going to be that it has access to larger impacts, it has access to a better time frame, it has access to arguments against military aid rather than just for developmental aid. So for instance, Pro can say, there are 1 million people who are at risk of starving in this region or dying of drought in this region in the next year if we don't do something. Your hypothetical scary terrorist scenario is unlikely, fewer people, and on an indeterminate time frame. So even if you're looking at pure body count framework, which usually the side arguing for military aid tends to want to do, Pro can still win out on that. Again, comparative evidence also helps here. Most authors arguing for military aid aren't going to say development is bad. They're going to say both are good. And maybe military aid is necessary to enable it. On the other hand, the authors arguing for developmental assistance, some of them will say, okay, we need military aid too, but many others will say, we need this instead of that. We need to stop giving military aid because it actually destabilizes the region worse than it helps it. And in that case, that gives Pro access to offense and turns that Con simply does not have. The other thing about Pro is it is easier to generalize the region. Each individual country's military struggles are slightly different. Most countries' developmental woes are very similar in terms of lack of infrastructure, lack of water, and just lack of the ability to attract the foreign investment that might be necessary to develop the economies traditionally. Con, on the other hand, Con's biggest advantage on this topic is that they don't need to argue about prioritization. They can say, if neither can be clearly prioritized over the other, that negates the resolution, we win. We don't need to show military aid is better than developmental assistance. We just need to show that it is more urgent or that they are equally urgent. I don't think Con wants to start the debate out aiming for equally urgent, aiming for a tie, because then any offense from Pro wins them the debate, but I do think that it's certainly a viable option to shift to in later speeches, saying that Pro has the burden to show why one should be clearly prioritized over the other, and if we show that an uncertain mix of both is necessary, that uncertainty alone is enough for us to win. Khan also wants to certainly make arguments about corruption. They want to make arguments about how without stability as a prerequisite, developmental assistance is going to be misappropriated, is going to end up funding these same groups who we think are threats, which again vary country to country. Khan needs to talk a lot more specifically about individual nations within the Sahel. Pro can talk about regional trends in the Sahel a lot more. Another thing that Khan can do is talk about escalation as a threat because there is no actor in the topic. One thing that Khan could say, for instance, is we need to prioritize military aid, because if we prioritize developmental aid, then the short-term instability that causes, if the African Union does not provide military aid, will allow the US or France to come in and bomb countries back to the 7th century. And that kind of military intervention is worse than military aid and is an alternative to it, which we think is empirically worse off. So that's one other thing that Khan can do with the topic. Again, this is probably the broadest topic people have had this whole year. There are many cases to be made on any of the individual countries in it. The important part is being able to characterize the region as a whole while still having specific examples and explaining why they are indicative. Obviously, there's a ton more that goes into this topic. My gut inclination is that Pro has a slightly stronger side starting out, though Khan certainly does have the advantage of being able to play to a tie if it comes to that. I'm not sure if that quite evens it out, but it's definitely more balanced than the past 2 months' topics, even if it is a lot broader and requires a lot more research. If you have any questions for the follow-up, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll try and get back to those sometime before the first tournament of this topic. Thanks for listening. Let me know what else you need on the topic.